The real story. Horror. Only. At Mr. Scare.
I never planned on buying anything that night. The auction house was one of those places that had a strange allure, an underground affair where people whispered more than they spoke, and the artifacts sold had stories just as murky as their origins. It was held in a dimly lit warehouse at the edge of town, a place that smelled of damp wood, fading ink, and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron, long forgotten. I stepped inside, blending into the sea of curious bidders, collectors, and opportunists, looking for something rare, something valuable, something with history. The air buzzed with hushed conversations and the rhythmic, hypnotic voice of the auctioneer, a wiry man in a worn-out suit who called out prices with the precision of a machine. Paintings with peeling edges, grandfather clocks with missing hands, a porcelain doll with one cracked eye. Each item carried a whisper of its past, but none of them held my interest, until I saw the cage. A rusted iron structure large enough to fit a mid-sized dog. Inside, perched with eerie stillness, was a parrot. Its feathers were a dull gray, frayed at the edges like an old coat that had seen too many winters. But it was its eyes that caught me, the piercing yellow orbs that burned with intelligence, far beyond what any bird should possess. "This one's special, folks," the auctioneer crooned, a talking parrot with a most unusual vocabulary. A few people chuckled, but most only cast wary glances at the bird, as if sensing something was off. I was about to turn away when the parrot turned its head and looked directly at me. Not a casual glance. This was something deliberate, calculating. The longer I stared, the more I felt as though the parrot was not just seeing me, but studying me. My pulse quickened. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I had to have it. The bidding started low. No one seemed eager to claim it. I hesitated only for a moment before raising my hand. A flicker of movement caught my eye. A man standing at the far corner of the room, partially obscured by shadows, turned his head sharply toward me. The auctioneer's gaze lingered on me, his fingers tightening on the gavel. There was something strange in his expression. Not excitement, not anticipation. Relief. "Sold," he said quickly, hammering down his gavel. The moment the deal was done, the man in the shadows turned and left the auction house without a word. My gut twisted. I had just bought more than I bargained for. I stepped forward, feeling every eye in the room on me as I approached the auctioneer's podium. "What's the story behind this bird?" I asked, my voice coming out more nervous than I intended. The auctioneer hesitated for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. "Estate sale," he said, forcing a smile. "The owner left it behind." "Left it behind," I echoed. "That's right," he said, his smile thinning. "Happens all the time." Something in his voice didn't sit right with me. But before I could press further, he motioned to one of his assistants, a burly man in a stained vest, to bring the cage down from the stage. The parrot didn't move as the man carried it toward me. Its head remained turned, its golden eyes locked onto mine. "Enjoy," the auctioneer said. "You got a good deal." I wasn't so sure. As I reached for my wallet, I heard a whisper, soft, barely audible, but clear as day. "Don't take me." I froze. The words weren't spoken by the auctioneer, nor by anyone in the crowd. They came from the bird. The murmur of voices around me continued, oblivious to what I'd just heard. The assistant set the cage down beside me, giving me a grunt before walking off. I swallowed hard and bent down, my fingers gripping the cold metal of the cage. "Did you just—" Before I could finish my sentence, the parrot blinked and turned away. I exhaled sharply and forced out a laugh, shaking off the chill that had crept up my spine. Just my imagination. or so I told myself. But as I wheeled the cage out of the auction house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The drive home was uneventful, yet an unsettling weight pressed against my chest. The parrot's cage sat in the passenger's seat, covered by an old sheet I'd found in my trunk. I told myself it was to keep it from getting cold, but deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't want it watching me. As I pulled up to my apartment building, the streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. I carried the cage inside, setting it down in the living room before hesitating. Silence. The parrot hadn't made a single sound since I left the auction. No rustling, no shifting, not even the faintest coo. I swallowed hard. Why did I expect it to speak again? Shaking off the unease, I turned away and headed to the kitchen. A drink. That's what I needed. Something strong to drown out the irrational dread curling in my stomach. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. I spun around so fast my glass nearly slipped from my fingers. The parrot was still motionless inside the cage, its golden eyes gleaming in the dim light of my apartment. I forced a breath and walked closer. "What did you say?" Nothing. The air in the room seemed heavier, the silence thick, like damp cotton. I reached for the cage, my fingers hesitating just before touching the cold, metal bars. "You imagined it," I murmured to myself. "That's all." But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, a breathy, rasping murmur. I froze. It wasn't words, not yet. But it was a sound, a human sound. My stomach clenched. My mind screamed at me to throw a blanket over the cage, shove it into the closet, pretend this whole night never happened. Instead, I did the stupidest thing possible. I opened the cage door. The parrot didn't move, didn't even flinch. Its head remained tilted at that unnatural angle, watching me with unreadable intent. My breath came shallow as I reached inside, fingers brushing against the rusted perch. "Come on," I whispered. "Say something." For a long, drawn-out moment, the bird remained eerily still. Then, in a voice that was not its own, it whispered, "He's watching." I stumbled back, my spine colliding against the wall. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to laugh, to shove the fear down into some deep, forgotten part of my brain. "Great, just great," I muttered. "I bring home a bird with a creepy vocabulary. What else is new?" But the parrot wasn't done. Its beady eyes gleamed, its head jerking slightly as it shifted its weight on the perch. And then, in a voice so close to my own that it made my blood run cold, it whispered, "Ethan." A chill crawled up my spine. It knew my name. I hadn't told it my name. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing inward. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it echoing in my ears. The parrot merely watched, unblinking. I reached forward and slammed the cage door shut. Enough for tonight. I grabbed an old towel and threw it over the cage, suffocating the glow of those unsettling golden eyes. Then I walked away, forcing myself not to look back. But as I climbed into bed, a lingering dread curled in my stomach. Because somewhere in the darkness of my apartment, muffled beneath layers of fabric and metal bars, the parrot whispered one last thing. It was a name I didn't recognize. And I knew somehow deep in my bones that whoever it belonged to, they were already dead. I spent the next morning convincing myself I'd imagined it. The parrot was just repeating words it had learned. That was all. There was nothing supernatural, nothing sinister, just a bird with an unusual vocabulary. But then, why did I feel so unsettled? I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the covered cage. The apartment was eerily silent, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sipped my coffee, but it tasted bitter, wrong. I needed to know where this bird came from. Ignoring the pit forming in my stomach, I pulled out my phone. The auctioneer had said something about an estate sale. Maybe I could trace it back, find out who owned it before me. I opened my laptop and searched for estate sales in the area, filtering for ones that had taken place around the time of the auction. It took an hour, but I found something. Estate sale. Items of the late Mr. Dorian Caldwell. A chill ran through me. The name didn't mean anything to me, but the details caught my attention. The auction listing was sparse: furniture, books, and one caged parrot, the only living thing left behind. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Why would someone leave behind their pet? Something wasn't right. I scrolled further. There were no family members listed, no heirs, just a mention that Caldwell had died under unusual circumstances. I felt a slow, creeping dread wrap around my ribs. Unusual circumstances. I looked at the cage again. The parrot remained still, silent, watching. I made my decision. I was going to find out who Dorian Caldwell was, and more importantly, why he died. I arrived at the city archives an hour later. The place was nearly empty, just an elderly receptionist who barely looked up as I walked in. "I need records on a man named Dorian Caldwell," I said, keeping my voice steady. She nodded, typing into a slow, outdated computer. After a moment, she frowned. "That's odd." I leaned forward. "What?" "Most people have at least some public records," she said, clicking through files. "But this man, it's like he barely existed. Just an address and a death certificate. No employment history? No relatives?" She shook her head. "Nothing. Just a record that he was found dead in his home 3 months ago. Cause of death, undetermined." I swallowed hard. 3 months ago. The same time the parrot went up for auction. I took a deep breath. "Can I see the police report?" She hesitated, then gestured to the microfilm archive. "You'll have to pull it yourself." I nodded and got to work. The process was slow, but after 30 minutes, I found what I was looking for. Dorian Caldwell, found deceased in his home. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. The report was thin. No apparent injuries, no cause of death, just dead. Except for one detail, a single note in the margins, written in rushed, uneven handwriting. The bird was talking when we arrived. It wouldn't stop. My blood turned to ice. I shoved the file away and practically ran out of the archives. The receptionist called after me, but I barely heard her. My heart was pounding. My thoughts were racing. Caldwell had died under mysterious circumstances, and his parrot, my parrot, had been there, talking. I needed to leave, now. I rushed home, nearly dropping my keys as I fumbled to unlock the door. I stepped inside, breathless, pulse hammering. The cage was open. My stomach lurched. The towel I had placed over the cage was on the floor. The parrot was perched on my bookshelf, staring at me. It opened its beak, and in a voice I had never heard before whispered, "He was murdered." I stood frozen in my apartment, staring at the parrot perched on my bookshelf, its golden eyes locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. "He was murdered," it had whispered. A chill ran through me. "No, this isn't real. It's just a bird." But I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread wrapping around my chest like a vice. The auction, the missing records, Dorian Caldwell's death. It was all connected. And somehow, this bird knew something. I needed to find out what. I spent the next hour trying to track down the auctioneer. I didn't have his name, only a vague memory of his face. Thin, wiry, with an expression I now recognized as something close to fear when I won the bid. The auction house itself was a dead end. No listings, no online records, no trace that it had ever existed. That left me with one option: go back to where it all started. The drive back to the warehouse was nerve-wracking. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, the memory of the auction replaying in my mind. When I arrived, my stomach dropped. The warehouse was still there, but barely. It had been abandoned. The windows were shattered, the doors chained shut. Spray-painted warnings covered the rusted walls. "Keep out. Death inside." I hesitated before stepping out of the car. The place looked like it had been deserted for years, but that wasn't possible. I had been here less than a week ago. Something wasn't right. I checked my phone. No service. Of course. I swallowed hard and walked toward the chained doors, looking for another way in. That was when I heard it, a rustling noise from inside. I wasn't alone. I stepped around the side of the building, my heart pounding, and found a partially open loading dock. I hesitated, then climbed inside. The air inside was thick with dust and decay. The remains of the auction still littered the space: broken chairs, scattered paperwork, the skeletal frame of the stage where the auctioneer had stood. Then I saw it, a desk, half buried under old files. I rushed to it, my hands trembling as I dug through the papers. Most of it was useless: handwritten notes, faded invoices. But then, buried underneath it all, I found something that made my blood run cold. A roster of auctioned items. And there it was. Lot number 43, African gray parrot, previously owned by Dorian Caldwell. My throat tightened. Next to the listing was a column labeled "Acquired from." There was a name written in bold, black ink: James Harlow. My breath caught in my throat. The same name I had seen in the crime blog. The last person to see Caldwell alive. I wasn't imagining it. This was real. Before I could process what this meant, I heard a creak behind me. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering. A shadow moved at the far end of the warehouse. Someone was here. I shoved the documents into my jacket and backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to run. But before I could move, something heavy crashed onto the floor. Then, from the darkness, came a voice. Low, measured, familiar. "You shouldn't be here." I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, slamming the door shut, my hands shaking as I jammed the keys into the ignition. I looked up, breathing heavily. A figure stood in the warehouse doorway, watching me, not moving, just watching. I tore out of the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't stop until I was back at my apartment, slamming the door behind me. The parrot was still there, perched on its cage, staring. I sank into a chair, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. James Harlow. He had owned the parrot before Caldwell. He had been the last to see Caldwell alive. And now someone knew I was looking for him. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The figure standing in the warehouse doorway. Watching. Waiting. I needed answers. But more than that, I needed to know if James Harlow was still alive. The next morning, I dug through every resource I had. Public records, obituaries, even crime reports. I expected to find something, anything. But James Harlow's name was nowhere. It was like he had been erased. Then I remembered the documents I had stolen from the auction house. I pulled them from my jacket, spreading them across my desk. Most were meaningless, lists of old artifacts, handwritten invoices. But then I found it, a ledger of past sales. My breath caught in my throat as I read. Harlow's name was listed multiple times, not just once, multiple transactions. And next to each of his purchases, there was a pattern. Every item he bought was later resold at another auction, weeks or months after the previous owner had died, including Dorian Caldwell's parrot. A chill ran through me. Harlow had owned the bird, and then, when Caldwell took it, he had died. Had Harlow been doing this for years? Had he been using the auctions to pick his victims? I had to track him down. There was one last lead, the auctioneer. He had been nervous when I won the bid. He knew something. I drove back to the address of the auction house, hoping against hope that the building wasn't truly abandoned. It was worse than abandoned. It was burned down. Only the skeletal remains of the warehouse stood, blackened and collapsed. The stench of ash still lingered in the air, despite the cold wind. Someone had destroyed it. Someone had erased everything. My pulse pounded in my ears. I was running out of time. I turned back toward my car, and that was when I saw him. A man stood across the street, leaning against a lamppost, watching me. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking. My throat tightened. I knew who he was before he even moved. James Harlow. He took a slow step forward, and then another. I scrambled into my car, locking the doors. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I fumbled with the keys, hands slick with sweat. Harlow stopped just short of the curb, and then, in the dim glow of the streetlights, I saw his lips move. He wasn't speaking. He was mouthing something. I didn't need to hear it to understand. "I know what you found." I slammed the car into gear and sped away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Harlow hadn't run, hadn't chased me, because he didn't need to. He knew where to find me. And the next time I saw him, I wouldn't get away. I didn't go home. Driving back to my apartment felt like a death sentence. Harlow knew where I lived. He had been watching me. I couldn't give him the chance to make a move first. Instead, I parked in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors breathing. The motel room felt like a coffin. The air was stale, thick with paranoia. Every creak of the walls, every distant sound of cars on the highway made my pulse quicken. I wasn't safe here. Not with Harlow still out there. Not with the parrot perched in the corner, watching me. I sat at the rickety desk, the auction documents spread before me. My fingers hovered over Caldwell's name, tracing the ink like it could give me the answers I needed. Dorian Caldwell had owned the parrot before me, and now he was dead. I kept going through the records. The ledger from the auction house wasn't just a list of sales. It was a pattern. Harlow had been buying and selling specific items, and the ones he sold always ended up with someone who later died under mysterious circumstances, including the parrot. The realization settled like lead in my gut. This wasn't just an auction house. It was a carefully curated network, a system designed to ensure that each item found its way into the hands of a specific target. And now, I was one of them. I ran a hand down my face. My mind raced through every option. Go to the police? With what? A story about a cursed parrot and a serial killer hiding behind an auction house? No. I needed something solid. I needed proof. I pulled out my phone and called the one person who might have it. The auctioneer. He picked up on the fourth ring. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't slept in days. "Who the hell is this?" "Ethan, the guy who bought the parrot." Silence, then a shaky breath. "You need to forget about this." "I can't." I kept my voice steady. "Harlow is coming for me. I need to know everything." A pause. "You don't understand. He doesn't stop. He doesn't lose." "Then let him watch. Just tell me, why did you help him? Why let him use the auction house?" A heavy exhale. I didn't have a choice. None of us did. I clenched my jaw. "Where is he?" The line went dead. I cursed under my breath. Damn it. Then, a text appeared on my screen. 1438 Winslow Ave. 1 hour. I stared at it, my heart pounding. Harlow's location. I had no idea if this was a trap. No idea if the auctioneer had just signed my death warrant. But I was done hiding. I grabbed my keys, my gun, and the parrot's cage. I was ending this tonight. The address led me to an abandoned industrial lot on the edge of town. The kind of place where no one asked questions and screams got swallowed by the wind. I parked a block away, keeping to the shadows as I approached the rusted warehouse. The place reeked of decay, of things long forgotten. My grip tightened on the gun tucked into my jacket. I wasn't sure if I was walking into a meeting or an execution. The parrot's cage felt heavier than it should have. The bird remained eerily silent, as if it knew what was coming. I stepped inside. The vast space was empty, save for a single overhead light flickering above a makeshift office at the far end. A desk, a chair, a figure standing in the shadows. Harlow. "Brave of you," he murmured, stepping into the dim glow. His eyes flickered to the cage. "And you brought it. I figured you'd want your little messenger back." He smiled, slow, calculated. "You always were clever." I tightened my stance. "Enough games. I know what you did. The auction house, the victims, the bird. You used it to terrify them, to get inside their heads before you killed them." Harlow tilted his head. "Did I? Or did they seal their own fate the moment they took it home?" My stomach twisted. "You picked them, just like you picked me." His smile widened. "Did I? Or did you choose yourself?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Why?" Harlow stepped closer, his voice dropping to something softer, almost intimate. "Fear is the purest form of control, Ethan. When someone hears their own name whispered in the dark, they unravel. They beg for answers. And when their fear consumes them," he gestured lazily with his hand, "I am there to help them cross over." I forced myself to stay still. "Caldwell figured it out, didn't he? That's why you killed him." Harlow's expression didn't change. "Caldwell was weak. He thought taking the bird would change the rules. But the game is older than him. Older than me. The bird always finds its way home." The parrot let out a slow, rattling sound, like a breath caught in its throat. My fingers twitched toward my gun. Harlow noticed. "Are you going to kill me, Ethan?" he asked, amusement lacing his words. "You think you're any different than the others? You're already playing the game. You can feel it, can't you? The weight of it. The eyes watching from the dark. You're already mine." The parrot shrieked. The sound hit like a hammer to my skull. High-pitched, unnatural, wrong. My vision swam. My balance wavered. Harlow moved, fast, too fast, his hand diving into his coat. A knife. I pulled my gun. A gunshot tore through the silence. Harlow staggered back, a hand clamped over his side. His eyes widened, but there was no fear, only surprise. And then, laughter. Low, guttural, amused. He sank to his knees, still clutching his wound. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and glistening. His smile never faltered. "It doesn't end here," he whispered. "The bird, it knows." The warehouse doors slammed open. Police flooded the space. Shouts, orders, flashlights cutting through the dark. I barely heard them, barely felt the hands grabbing me, pulling me back. My eyes stayed locked on Harlow as he collapsed to the ground, still grinning, still watching me. Then, nothing. The officers moved in, securing the area. One of them approached, speaking, but I barely processed the words. "We've been after him for years," the cop was saying. "The auction house, the disappearances. We knew something was happening, but we could never prove it." "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The officer hesitated. "We closed the case. Harlow's dead. The auction house is gone. It's over." I glanced at the cage. The parrot stared back. "And the bird?" The cop shrugged. "It'll be taken to a secure facility." A deep chill settled in my bones. The parrot ruffled its feathers. Then, in a voice I knew wasn't Harlow's, wasn't mine, wasn't anyone who should exist, it whispered my name. I sucked in a breath. No, the cycle wasn't over. The parrot always finds its way home, and some secrets, they never stay buried. The police took the parrot. I watched as the officer, a tall man with sharp features and an expression too neutral to be real, lifted the cage and carried it toward an unmarked police car. "Where are you taking it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Secure facility," he replied. "Evidence storage." But something in his tone felt wrong. I should have spoken up. I should have stopped him, but I didn't. 3 years later, I had convinced myself that it was over, that Harlow was gone, that the auction house was dead, that the parrot, whatever it was, had finally been silenced. Then I saw the news. Underground auction busted in Chicago. My blood ran cold. I opened the article, scanning through the details. The authorities had raided an illicit auction house, one almost identical to the one where I had bought the parrot. The report listed items seized, suspicious deaths linked to past buyers, and then at the very bottom of the article a name: Officer Daniel Mercer. I stared at the screen, my breath locked in my chest. The same officer who had taken the parrot that night. I dug deeper, pulling up more reports. Mercer had been under investigation for months, suspected of corruption, ties to criminal organizations, ties to the auction network, ties to Harlow. He hadn't taken the bird to a secure facility. He had taken it to keep the cycle alive. The realization hit like ice in my veins. The auction house had never really died. It had just moved, adapted, found new prey. And Mercer, he had become Harlow's replacement. I clicked on another article. My breath caught in my throat. The investigation had uncovered a network, not a single operation. Dozens of auctions. Victims spanning multiple states. A system that had been running for decades. Harlow was never working alone. Harlow was never just a man. He was a name, a role, a legacy. And now Mercer had taken his place. That night, I barely slept. Every noise in my apartment felt too deliberate. Every shadow in the corner of my vision felt too deep. At 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated. Then I answered. Silence. Then, a voice. Not human, not mine, not Harlow's. A whisper that crawled beneath my skin. "Ethan." I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. Then the voice spoke again. "It's your turn now." The line went dead. I turned slowly toward my living room. The window was open. The curtains shifted in the wind. And on my coffee table, where nothing had been before, a single gray feather. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. The parrot always finds its way home. And some secrets, they never stay buried. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please hit follow to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you soon, and goodbye.